My part one is going to focus on the first part of our title. The more who die, the less we care. And some questions that I will address. Uh, what are the psychological, social, and political obstacles blocking effective decisions and actions on some of the world's urgent risk problems? And some of these include COVID-19 and more generally pandemic disease, climate change, genocide and mass atrocities, nuclear war, and partisan political violence, which is more of I'll just touch on lightly. I'm looking at that mostly within the American lens. And I should also mention that my perspective is mostly comes from research in the United States and Western countries. It's always important uh, in an international context to appreciate the fact that there may be cultural and national differences in the way people respond to these issues. And that's something that we may want to discuss later, or that I would invite further research to look at, whether my story is how universal it is and how culturally specific it is. We have to be sensitive to that. Further questions, more recent vintage, refers to the issue of whether Vladimir Putin might resort to using chemical or nuclear weapons in Ukraine or elsewhere, and what should be done in light of this story that I'm about to present. And as I mentioned, then I'll turn that over to Scott to deal with the tough problems. So my path will be looking at some relevant psychological concepts and mechanisms to apply to these problems. And in particular, I'll focus on what Scott and I have called the deadly arithmetic of compassion. And it consists of, uh, of three psychological mechanisms, which I'll describe in a bit of detail: psychic numbing, pseudo inefficacy, a false sense of inefficacy, and what we call security prominence, or more generally, the prominence effect. I'll describe each of these in turn. And for theoretical foundation, I would refer you to this well-known book by psychologist Daniel Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2002, despite the fact that he's not an economist. And in 2011, he wrote this book, Thinking Fast and Slow, to describe the work that he and others have done over many decades on learning how how our minds work. I'm told this book has sold over 15 million copies, which is rather remarkable for a book which is sort of an academic textbook. And in this book, Professor Kahneman talks about two modes of thinking. When he refers to fast thinking, we also can call this the experiential way of thinking, or sometimes called System One. And it's basically relying on our intuitions and the images and associations that flit through our mind very rapidly and create feelings in us, which we sometimes refer to with the term affect. It's really a jargon for feelings, positive and negative feelings about the information that we're experiencing. And it's very sensitive to stories and narratives, which convey feelings. And it's often non-conscious. We don't even realize we're thinking in this way. And this is in contrast to the slow way of thinking, which is analytical, and it's what we're taught to do in school, to be logical and deliberate, and to use reasons and symbols and numbers and mathematics, and we're very conscious when we're doing it, because we understand what we're trying to do, and often struggle to do it. And it also creates feelings in us, but usually the feelings come later after we've done the analysis, whereas in the fast system, feelings occur almost instantaneously to when information comes into our sphere of attention. So I'll be talking about both of these ways of thinking, and how they cause problems for us in the face of large scale problems of facing the world. And what we have learned over the years is that, we mostly perceive risk not as a result of analysis, and we can do analysis and we should do analysis, but most of the time we react very quickly with an intuitive gut feeling in the fast thinking mode. And I have a book about the research on this called The Feeling of Risk. Uh, and by the way, Scott and I are happy to share our slides with anyone who's interested. We'll show a lot of slides. They're all available to anyone who's interested in it. So basically, fast thinking is what we would say is our default mode of thinking. It's because it's easy to do. It feels right. It usually works to get us through the day. We make a lot of decisions during our day, and we're not going around with a pencil, paper, calculator, analyzing the pros and the cons in some uh, a deliberate way. We just sort of think, experience the feelings that we have when we think about making one decision or another, and rely on that. And so it usually works for us if our feelings have been educated by experience. But the problem is it is innumerate, and thus can lead to serious mistakes when the stakes of the problem are very high. So fast thinking, I would argue, deceives us in the face of threats such as COVID-19, climate change, genocide, and nuclear war, and other major disasters, natural disasters. And also slow thinking can also fail us too. That's what I'll talk about, what we call the prominence effect. So this is where I'm going, and let's start with genocide and mass atrocities. Um, so the problem here is that we are incoherent in how we value life, both human and non-human life. We value individual lives greatly, but those lives lose their value when they become part of a larger crisis. As a result, we do too little to protect life in the face of existential threats to humanity and to environment. Uh, After World War II and the Nazi atrocities and the Holocaust and elsewhere, we vowed that never again would we allow this kind of thing to take place. But unfortunately, that has not been the case. We really see that again and again, catastrophic episodes of killing uh, are through genocide and other forms of mass atrocities are all too common. They create an immense toll of suffering and death, often with little notice or resistance from the outside world. So this slide was presented at a lecture I heard when we had a seminar a number of years ago in Auschwitz on genocide. And the presenter was a woman named Barbara Harf, a scholar of genocide. And this figure, which is not very readable, basically has a simple and disturbing story. The title is Genocides and Political Mass Murders from 1950 to 2003. And you see that there are dozens of instances around all over the world where large numbers of people were killed by their governments or by other agents of violence. So it happens quite often, and as we speak, there are countries around the world where mass killing is taking place. And obviously, Ukraine is in everyone's minds right now as one example of this. So it goes on and on. And so the overarching question is, why do we rarely intervene in mass murder, genocide, and other human and environmental catastrophes? And there's obviously no one simple answer to a question like this. There are many answers. I mean, it's clearly dangerous, costly, and difficult for some nation to go into another sovereign nation that's killing its citizens and intervene there. It's difficult in all these ways. There's issues of racism. Sometimes the people who are being abused are of a different race or culture, and that reduces our sense of empathy for them. And also, if it's taking place at a distance from us, that reduces the response. And there's issues of responsibility. Uh, shouldn't many different nations all be working on this? Why should any one nation shoulder that burden of intervention? But my focus has been on the highlighted, yellow highlighted psychological concepts, which are psychic numbing, and which is the fact that the information we get fails to convey the feelings and emotion that are needed to motivate us, to spark us, our motivation to act. Second problem is a false sense of inefficacy, that even when there are things we can do as individuals or nations, we may feel that we are not doing enough, and therefore we back away and don't do what we can do. Well, and also, lastly, there's a complicated mechanism, which is the dominance of protecting certain prominent objectives, such as national security, over protecting foreign lives when decisions are made. This is the prominence effect. I'll talk a little bit about each of these next. So these are the three mechanisms I just mentioned, and they all contribute to this arithmetic of compassion, and the shocking summary statement that in many cases, the more who die, the less we care. And so basically, when we're relying on our feelings, uh, we're deceived because the feeling system doesn't count very well. Uh, Saving one life is huge. It's very important. Uh, but if there are two people at risk, sometimes the importance feels less than twice that of one, and sometimes even less than the importance we feel for one. I'll talk about some research that shows this. And this is basically saying that our feelings don't add very well. Um, Multiplication is just a form of fast adding, so it's not surprising that our feelings don't multiply either. And this is illustrated in two related quotes by famous people. So Annie Dillard, a famous American writer, in 1999 was contemplating what was then the population of China. She said there are 1,198,500,000 people alive now in China. To get a feel for what this means, and I highlight the word "feel" and "means" because the meaning of information is to a large part driven by the feelings that information creates in us. So to get a feel for what this number means, just take yourself in all your singularity, importance, complexity, and love, and multiply by 1,198,500,000, and then she sort of stabs us with the conclusion. See, nothing to it, where she's probably smiling because she knows that we can't do this really very well. We learn to read and write and add and subtract large numbers, but we're not taught to try to understand the reality beneath the surface of these numbers. And very interestingly, from a completely different direction, a Nobel Prize winning biologist who was concerned about nuclear war and the destruction of cities with nuclear weapons said, "I'm deeply moved if I see one man suffering and would risk my life for him." Then I talk impersonally about the possible pulverization of our big cities with 100 million dead. I am unable to multiply one man's suffering by 100 million. So he recognizes the failure of the multiplication of these feelings. And so this brings us to two important questions. How should we value the protection of human lives? And how do we value the protection of human lives? And why do the answers to these questions differ? And why does this matter? So here's two possible answers to the should question. We call these normative answers. One is if every life is intrinsically of equal importance or value, then as the number of lives at risk increase, the value of protecting them should increase in some linear fashion. We just add their value, and we might want to tweak this a little bit in the case where we're getting to to the edge of say genocide or extinction of a species, where the next lives lost could lead to genocide, the destruction of a culture or a people or a species, where those lives are even more important to protect than the ones that came before them. So the curve uh, goes upward quite steeply. So these are two normative models. And then we ask, well, what do we know from science and also from just experience, history, about how we do value uh, catastrophic threats? And we find that our actions in the face of these threats don't follow either of these normative models. That's because our feelings override our analytic judgments, our normative judgments, and these feelings tend to be insensitive to large losses of life. So here's what schematically two ways that we do value lives as the number of lives increases. So the first one, model on the left, is a model where the very first life is most important. You see the very steep increase in value, and then two is not twice as high as one in terms of valuing or importance. And then at some point it flattens out. And the model on the right is even more, well, the one on the left is disturbing because it means that life, which is so important, if it's the very first and only life that we're concerned about, is very valuable. But that life loses its value if it's part of a larger problem, a larger tragedy, where an additional life doesn't seem to mean anything different. And it's even worse than that. In some cases, as the numbers increase, not only do we become insensitive, like the flattening of the curve on the left, but the concerns collapse. They fade or collapse and become even less as the numbers increase. I'll illustrate both of these very briefly. So we can do a kind of a thought experiment on this model on the left, the insensitivity. You think about how you might feel when you see or learn about a child who's starving, and you probably feel badly about that child, that situation. And supposing I was to say, well, there are 5 children starving, and you maybe see their pictures, you might feel a bit worse. Uh, and then I say, oh, wait a minute, it's really 6 children. I would propose that you won't feel any different thinking about 6 children than about 5 children. Just, your feelings won't do that. You can obviously, if you do the numbers, you know that 6 is 1 additional child more. So if you think about the numbers, you can appreciate it. But if you're relying on your feelings are insensitive. And so laboratory experiments can demonstrate numbing and compassion collapse, but we also can see that when we look outside our windows and see what's going on in the world. But here's an example very quickly of an experiment that shows this insensitivity. Here it was done right after the genocide that took place in Rwanda in 1994, where 800,000 people were murdered by the rival tribe in about 100 days, and the world stood by and did nothing to prevent that. And those who survived the genocide, the Tutsi population, fled to neighboring to what was then Chad, a neighboring country, and were put in refugee camps, large numbers of people in refugee camps. And they began to, they lacked clean water, and they began to contract and often die from cholera. So my colleagues and I were looking for a way to study this issue, the numbing, and we saw this clipping in the local paper that said that the people in the camps needed clean water, and there needed to be well drilling equipment sent to the camp and pumps that could provide clean water to keep people healthy. And so we created two scenarios around this, and one which said, well, basically we said that you're an official in a neighboring country, you'd like to help, and you have enough money to provide drilling and pumping equipment that could provide water that could keep 4,500 people in the camp healthy indefinitely. Would you do it? And you have other ways that you could spend your money. You could spend it internally by improving your schools or your hospitals and so forth, but would you instead send the money to the camp to keep 4,500 people healthy and hopefully alive? And the experiment was we varied the size of the camp. One group we told the camp has 250,000 people in it. You can keep 4,500 people alive, healthy. The other group we said the camp has 11,000 people. You can keep 4,500 people alive. And so, which camp do you think there was more support for sending the money? Your intuitions would probably be correct here. Participants were more willing to send clean water to save 4,500 lives in a refugee camp of 11,000 than to send water to save 4,500 lives in a large camp of 250,000. And this is very much in keeping with that function on the left of it that I showed you, reducing 250,000 people at risk to 245,500 seems less of a difference than reducing from 11,000 to 6,500, even though it's the same number of lives. So we see that the number of lives is gauged not by the number, but by the proportion of lives, which is in keeping with the psychic numbing on that curve on the left that we see. But what about the collapse function on the right? There's experiments on that as well. And here's an experiment by Kogan and Ritov, two Israeli psychologists, a number of years ago, and they posed the question again to different groups of people. In one group, they said there's a child being treated for cancer, and their treatment costs about $300,000. Will you donate towards that, and how much? And the second group was said there are 8 children being treated for cancer and the cost for all the 8 in total is $300,000. Would you donate, and how much? And this is what the donations looked like. There was a greater donation to a single individual than to a group of 8 people. So you see, actually, it's not only greater, it's reduced. And the further research, so that my colleagues and I were very much interested by this first study, and we decided to do more research on it. And we said, well, what if there was only 2 people in need instead of 1? Would we still see that? And we found that indeed that was the case. So it relates to a question again by Annie Dillard, who the author who I mentioned earlier, who was asked the question, at what number do other individuals blur for me? She was thinking about compassion fatigue. And so we did an experiment. We gave people the opportunity to donate to, in 3 cases of children who were facing starvation. In one case, we illustrated the problem with a single little girl named Rokia. A second group could donate to children like the little boy Musa. The third group could donate to children like, and we showed both pictures, Rokia and Musa, and we asked them how sympathetic or concerned are you to their plight of the children, and how much would you donate? And we found, well, I'm missing, the slide doesn't show the data, but what we found was that when there were 2 children, the feelings of concern and the donations were less than when there were a single child. So the answer to Annie Dillard's question from this experiment is that maybe individuals begin to blur and compassion begins to collapse, even as low as 2 people instead of 1. And we can think of that in terms of what we call empathy, the feeling, understanding how other people are feeling and seeing the world. And we say you can empathize with someone by putting yourself in another person's shoes. But what if there are 2 people? It so happens that after we did this study, there was an exhibit of Cuban art and sculpture in our local community. And there was a sculpture that showed how difficult it may be to put yourself in the shoes of 2 people. A Cuban artist created a shoe for 2 people. And it looked like this. I took a picture of it. The picture in the middle. So you see, it's a very awkward device. You would have a hard time fitting your your feet into that shoe for two people. And just as physically you would have a hard time, the mind has a harder time capturing the essence of two people than one, and therefore creating the same kinds of feelings for two than for one. So with more people, as the numbers of people increase, attention diminishes as the numbers increase. Images are deficient with large numbers. Feeling collapses when the number becomes large. And then there's another problem, which I'll turn to next, is that the bad feelings about those we can't help demotivate us. But before I finish the psychic numbing, just think about the fact that we are losing lives not only through genocide but through extinction. This clipping shows that says species are vanishing quicker than any point in the last 65 million years. And the question is, do we have to wait till the last individual of a species is there before we wake up to the fact that there's a problem here, that we need to act when the numbers are still large, not when the numbers are small there. So the second problem is this pseudo inefficacy that I mentioned. And what we've learned is that bad feelings about what we cannot do demotivate us from doing what we can do to help others at risk. It's a false sense of inefficacy called pseudo inefficacy. And it happens even when the information that conveys bad or negative feelings is completely irrelevant. And this is irrational. And so again, to show how one might study this in an experiment, we gave people the opportunity to donate to an organization called Save the Children on behalf of children like our little girl on the left, a 7-year-old girl from Mali who's facing starvation. And some people did and some people didn't. And then we had a second study where we thought, well, maybe we could get more people to donate if we impressed upon them that this is a really big problem in the region. So we put the statistical story of how many lives, how many people were at risk in that region of Africa, thinking it would increase the number of people who donated. The amount donated had just the opposite effect. The donations dropped in half when the statistics were presented. And then we said, well, there are millions that at risk. What if there was only 6 children that you couldn't help? And we found that also we had a group that could help a single child, or a single child, or then that single child when they also knew that there were 6 that they couldn't help, and the concern, the feelings of compassion and the donations dropped. And then we said, well, maybe it's just we're drawing attention away from the child on the left, whose name was Nelson. So we put irrelevant pictures that conveyed negative feelings, like a handgun pointing at you or a snarling dog. And that had the same effect as the children. So we knew it could be completely irrelevant feelings that come in and mingle with the relevant concerns and the good feeling you anticipated when you help a child, and demotivate that. So this is another weird way that our feelings work. The brain lets irrelevant feelings in that mess up the relevant feelings, and we can talk about that. Now, the last component of arithmetic of compassion is beyond the numbing. That it's a more, even when we think slowly and reason, and we have to make a trade-off between conflicting objectives, this can be biased, causing our actions to contradict our values. And this is what we call the prominence effect. And it's another reason we ignore genocides and mass atrocities. It results from a misguided slow thinking when decided between options that require a trade-off between conflicting objectives. That we do one thing, maybe it leads to greater safety or greater protection of people, but on the other hand, it has a higher cost than doing nothing there. And so this is related to limitations of human attention, and we simplify this conflict by focusing attention on only one element of the trade-off. And this happens when we make all kinds of judgments and decisions about risk and other things in our life. So basically, in genocide, strongly held humanitarian values tend to decline or even collapse when decision-making requires a trade-off between protecting these lives and issues of protecting our own security. This can lead us to make choices that can contradict our expressed values. For example, we value human lives greatly, but choose so as to protect our security rather than protect their lives. And you know, this model that we thought we had when we have conflicting objectives, that they kind of like weigh them, the pros and the cons, in some compensatory manner, is false. It doesn't happen this way. Our attention is focused on one of the elements. In many cases, it's security, and 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 uh, and and we forget about the lives, and therefore we don't act to protect them, not because we say they're not important, but because our attention is focused elsewhere. This is a limitation of attention. A very famous experiment about inattentional blindness is sort of relevant here. Um, it was a study where people saw a group of people passing a basketball around, and they were told to count the number of passes. And then after they did this, they were asked, "Did you see the person in the gorilla suit walking through the through the group?" And most people didn't see the gorilla because their attention was focused on the other people passing the basketball. That shows how fragile and focused our attention can be, and we often aren't attending to the most important things we should we should be attending to. And this is also relevant to why we're slow to act on climate change. Our focus, even though we know climate change is important, we're thinking about other things like the price of gasoline or the need to use fossil fuels to get the conveniences that we value so highly, and so we don't make the proper decisions. And I'm going to skip through. I've already gone a little bit over my time, so I can also say that in recent years I've been looking at this security issue in war, and for example, from the American perspective, we certainly assert that the lives of enemy civilians are vital to protect, but scholars of the military contend that Americans appear to be willing to kill foreign civilians on a massive scale whenever such attacks are considered useful to defend critical U.S. national security interests and protect the lives of significant numbers of, say, U.S. military personnel. There was a big expose just this year in the American military where, well, first I should say that historically, scholars like Downs, looking over from 1816 to 2003 about this, concluded that states, including democracies, tend to prize victory in preserving the lives of their own people above humanity in welfare. And it concluded desperation overrides moral inhibition against killing non-competence. Competence, that's again a form of prominence, the prominence of security over other people's lives. And there was a scandal in the U.S. about how the U.S. has been abusing civilians in crises such as in Syria or in Afghanistan and so forth. And we've ordered there's an investigation to try to change this in the military. And I can also say that this is also very relevant to the potential use of nuclear weapons. Where even though one would say that it is important to use nuclear weapons if a nation's security is threatened, it is likely, as it was for America in World War II and Japan, it's a much greater chance that nuclear weapons will be used. And I don't have time to go into recent research that challenges the ability to make rational decisions about nuclear weapons. For example, with regard to psychic numbing, if we can't appreciate the immense consequences that we can create with nuclear weapons, due to psychic numbing, how can we make a rational a weighing of the benefits, the short-term military benefits of using nuclear weapons against the immense long-term costs if we cannot comprehend the costs? And there's more to this story, but maybe we can discuss that later, or if you're interested, I can refer you to papers. And it's very much relevant to Vladimir Putin, whose security and his prestige is seriously threatened by the poor showing of that his military is having in Ukraine, would this then threaten him in a way that makes the potential use of nuclear weapons by him greater? It's a question of the day. So basically, that's my story. We're inconsistent and often incoherent in our valuation of human life. We value individual lives greatly, but these lives lose their value when they become part of a larger crisis, and we often, as a result, do too little to protect human lives in the face of threats from violence, natural disasters, and other causes. And understanding the strengths and weaknesses of our feelings and reasoning processes is a necessary first step towards valuing lives humanely and improving decisions. And with that, I'll turn it over to Scott. Thank you very much.